Assetto Corsa Competizione is a hard-boiled racing sim, with carefully modeled car handling and endless customization, all in service of an authentic racing experience. It requires careful attention to brake markers, car parameters like tire pressure and fuel load, and grip levels on constantly changing track surfaces. This is far from the breezy arcade fun of something like Forza Horizon, or even a slightly gentler simcade racer like Gran Turismo. It's a rather punishing sim, although you can soften it through driving assists as needed. Competizione is definitely more of a PC-centric title, but it did receive a console port in 2020, though in somewhat compromised form. It ran at an unstable frame rate, with irregular motion consistency and controller response times, critically undermining the racing gameplay. However, last week Competizione received a full-on current-gen console version, one that promises a boost to 60 FPS alongside larger races and a raft of other improvements. Can this new console edition deliver a polished and smooth sim racing experience? Or have we just exchanged old technical issues for new ones? Assetto Corsa Competizione offers a realistic sim of the 2018 and 2019 GT World Challenge Racing Series, with a mix of career modes, single-player challenges, and single-player and multiplayer competitive races to test your skills in some of the fastest touring cars on the planet. The GT3 cars are really the stars of the show here. Car exteriors and interiors are well handled, with strong materials work and accurate-looking reflections. Car bodywork is suitably high poly and feels like a close match for the real thing. There are some nice flourishes here as well. Car mirrors are actually functional, for instance, and reflect back a rasterized, low-detail version of the environment. The trackside environments aren't quite as impressive, although they still look mostly fine in motion. Track surfaces and grass look quite flat, background buildings and structures are on the lower poly side, and spectators are mostly represented by crude 2D billboards. These are typical compromises in last-gen racing games, but they do tend to stick out somewhat here, particularly at high resolutions. But all of that applies to all versions of the game, including the last-gen console versions, which Tom covered in a prior video. So what do the current-gen machines have to offer? According to publisher 505 Games, current-gen Competizione comes with support for 30 driver races, 60 FPS gameplay, 4K resolution, and faster load times. That's a slightly scant list for a next-gen upgrade, but there are some surprises here. Let's start with the PS5 and Series X. The premium current-gen consoles get a few unannounced settings upgrades over the One X, which offered the best last-gen console version. There's an excellent new bokeh depth of field blur on the new consoles that kicks in before races. One X did seem to make use of a slight Gaussian blur on some of these pre-race shots, but the effect on the new consoles is much stronger and more pleasing. Bushes and trees are differently placed on the new consoles as well, and are more numerous than on last-gen console. Shadows are improved on PS5 and Series X as well. The One X had distractingly low-res shadow maps that suffered from a lot of breakup during gameplay. Series X and PS5 improve things here with higher resolution, more defined shadows. PS5 oddly has an edge in shadow quality over the Series X, however. If you look at the shadows behind this car here, the PS5 has more detailed shadows that appear more coherent in motion, with the Series X splitting the difference between the PS5 and the One X. But what about Series S? All of what I said about the premium machines applies, with a few exceptions. Grass density seems lower on Series S than either premium console. Texture clarity takes a big hit on Series S, with most textures smearing out when viewed at oblique angles. This is most noticeable on road surfaces and on the detailing on car roofs. Texture filtering is quite poor across all current-gen consoles, so it seems likely that much of this effect is coming from the reduction in rendering resolution. Finally, shadow resolution seems about the same as it is on Series X, so shadows look good, but are not quite as refined as on PS5. On the whole though, these are pretty minor differences that required a lot of flipping back and forth to notice. Assetto Corsa Competizione sees some small upgrades on current-gen machines, which do manage to shore up some of the problems evident on the last-gen release. Some of the more glaring issues I noticed playing Competizione at launch on last-gen consoles still have not been fixed, even on the current-gen release. The lighting in the mirror view often looks very different from the game lighting, for instance, and can be too dark to distinguish cars. Car models still leave behind streaky screen space reflection artifacts on wet tracks. And camera angle transitions in event replays often load in with scene geometry missing for a frame or two, or momentarily flash to the wrong shot entirely. These aren't huge issues, but they do distract at times and convey an unfortunate lack of polish. Let's move on to resolution. Series X targets a full 4K, and reaches that resolution most of the time. The full resolution range here seems to be 1440p to 2160p, although Assetto Corsa is almost always close to or at a full 4K output. Even in relatively intense scenes, we see 2160p or 2016p as the typical raw pixel count. PS5 has a somewhat looser grip on 4K. The target is still 2160p, but there's somewhat more variance, and the new lower bound in my testing is 1152p. Many shots still resolve at a full 4K, but busy shots with lots of cars and weather effects tend to bring resolution down to the 1800p range. And one particularly demanding shot came in at 1152p, though this was an extreme outlier. Both PS5 and Series X hold up very well on a 4K display. The resolutions here are either native 4K or close enough that it would be difficult to tell the difference at typical viewing distances. Temporal anti-aliasing is used here, though it feels like it's a pretty light implementation, as the image remains very sharp and aliasing is still noticeable in higher contrast parts of the image. The Series S scales things back here, mostly rendering at 1080p. Initially I thought we were looking at a locked 1920 by 1080, but in some select circumstances resolution can climb higher, up to a maximum of 1440p in my testing. These above 1080p moments seem to only occur in select replay angles when no cars are on screen, however. Actual gameplay seems to be a locked 1080p, or very close to it. The car selection viewer on Series S does seem to run at a locked 2160p, however, which seems to have been a conscious decision from the developer as the framerate dives to the low 20s here. PS5 and Series X also render the car viewer at a full 4K, but maintain a locked 30 FPS. In every gameplay segment or replay, Series S generally renders at 1080p with a maximum of 1440p in rare instances, so 2160p does not seem achievable in the normal run of play. As a point of comparison, the fully patched 1X version turns in a range of 1152p to 1800p in my testing, although it generally hangs between 1440p and 1800p. The 1X may be able to hit 4K in very limited circumstances, but even in very sparse scenes and in the car viewer, the highest result I could achieve is 1800p. The PS5 and Series X both generally push higher res and noticeably cleaner results. Series S lags well behind, of course, with the sort of 1080p class image we've come to expect from the console. Let's move on to performance. 505 Games promises 60 FPS gameplay here, seemingly a big upgrade from the unstable, unlocked framerate on last-gen consoles. That's not quite what we're getting here, unfortunately. PS5 is the best performer of the bunch. Most races play back at a virtually locked 60 FPS, with a one-off dropped frame every so often, but little else to compromise the experience. During stress tests with 26 or more AI vehicles and heavy rain, and while intentionally driving to maximize the number of on-screen cars, I was able to drop the framerate to the high 50s for extended periods, with a low around 55 FPS. This is a very atypical situation though, and in races with slightly fewer AI drivers or lighter weather conditions, Competizione offers a very solid 60 FPS update on PS5. And feels appropriately responsive and smooth. Series X mostly holds 60 FPS with lower car count races in clear conditions, with some occasional dips into the 50s. Amp up the complexity a little by adding some heavy weather though, and framerates will hover in the mid to low 50s with occasional dives into the upper 40s, with replays that can hit framerates as low as the mid 30s. Dialing up the complexity by maxing out every option in a stress test scenario sees framerates dive further still. Series S offers broadly similar performance to the Series X, but it is a bit shakier. Smaller races in clear conditions tend to straddle 60 FPS, with frequent runs into the 50s. More intense races and stress tests hold pretty close to the Series X, but with a small performance deficit in similar footage. Replays run especially poorly, and can output in the 30 FPS range for long stretches. Neither Series X nor S offers a particularly solid rendition of Competizione, although S is noticeably worse. Returning to the One X, we get an unlocked framerate that hovers around 30 FPS, with constant stutter. The framerate tends to hover between 31 and 36 frames per second, and the game has a pervasive stutter courtesy of this uneven frame delivery. All of the current gen console releases have better performance than last gen. Only the PS5 feels really solid here, however. The Xbox Series consoles just can't maintain a stable 60 FPS, and feel very uneven. Series S is the worst of the bunch, and Series X is only mildly better. There are some controller differences between the platforms that are worth noting here as well. Assetto Corsa controls nicely with a wheel, which is my preference, although it works well enough on a gamepad, especially if you play with more of the assist features enabled. The Xbox Series pad is serviceable here, but the DualSense really stands out, with precise tactile feedback that makes every gear shift, curb, and chicane feel distinct. The resistance triggers are used sparingly, which feels like the right call, although the left trigger does bite and kick back when you brake and skid at speed. It's a thoughtful implementation that makes you feel much more in tune with the vehicle. Finally, a word on load times. Loading on the One X is a slightly painful experience. An AI race on the Zandvoort circuit here takes 31 seconds before you see the track. Every time you want to start a new race, you'll have to wait roughly this long, which gets a little bit tedious. Current gen consoles power through this loading much more quickly. Both Xbox Series consoles take around 8 seconds, with the PS5 curiously a few seconds behind. It's a big improvement and makes Competizione a more fluid experience. So the final verdict. Assetto Corsa Competizione is an attractive last-gen racer with a few key improvements on current-gen consoles. The most significant of these enhancements, a new 60 FPS framerate target, greatly improves the gameplay experience on the PS5. Both Xbox Series consoles can't quite keep up though, resulting in near constant judder in many scenarios. All consoles benefit from the suite of visual enhancements on current-gen machines, with the settings tweaks plus resolution boosts, particularly improving the visuals on PS5 and Series X. The PS5's shadow quality advantage makes it the pick here as well, though Series X isn't far behind, and Series S looks perfectly respectable for the hardware. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for notifications for new videos. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.